And we're live. Welcome to episode 28 of Engaging the Eagle, exploring US foreign policy in Southeast Asia. I'm Kevin.
Hi, this is Adrian.
And we'll be your host for this episode, where we ask the question, why is Southeast Asia drifting towards China? It is often said that Southeast Asian countries reject a zero-sum choice between aligning with either Washington or Beijing, preferring to engage both parties in the pursuit of their national interests. Yet a recent study has shown that, despite the intentional preferences of these Southeast Asian governments, their policies point towards a drift towards China. What could this mean for the region, and what could Washington do to reverse this drift? To discuss this topic, we've invited one of the study's authors, Professor Joseph Liow, to come on our show. Professor Liow is the Tangakaki Chair of Comparative and International Politics and Dean of the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Thanks for joining us today, Professor.
Sure, thanks Kevin. Thanks Adrian.
For the benefit of our audience, let's start with the basics first. When it comes to grand strategy and questions of influence, three of the terms that get thrown around a lot are hedging, balancing, and bandwagoning. What are the differences between these terms?
Kevin, these are, in a sense, rather academic terms, right? Academic concepts, and they're used quite frequently in the field of international relations. In brief, I think the idea of balancing comes about where you're thinking of states, especially states that perceive either a challenge or threat that is before them. And what they do is they align with other states that may share those concerns for the same particular threat or challenge. And together they balance against it, right? So that's balancing in short. Bandwagoning is kind of the opposite, 180-degree turn, right? So rather than try to corral a group of countries to help deal with the security challenge, you kind of go with the flow, right?
Yeah.
In other words, you bandwagon with the challenge. And people who identify this or advocate this in international affairs, their assumption is that if you do that, that would not only sort of nullify to great extent the challenge itself, but you may even derive benefits from going with it or aligning with it, right?
Yeah.
And hedging is kind of like in between. Hedging is a very popular concept and it rolls off the tongue, right? Because it's the whole idea that you are confronted with uncertainty. You're not clear about the intentions of certain states that you're dealing with, and therefore you want to hedge, you want to keep your options open. You don't want to be seen clearly aligned with one state or another state. Yeah? And of course, you are aware that in the context of Southeast Asia and the discussions with regards to where regional countries locate themselves vis-a-vis the US and China, the term hedging is used very often by analysts, by scholars, by policymakers, by politicians as well.
Yes, that's right. Most countries in Southeast Asia, they at least profess that they're following a strategy of hedging. But could you go a little bit more into why they would not want to align too closely with either the US or China?
I think most of the countries in Southeast Asia, and first, of course, we got to bear in mind that it's a very diverse range of countries, right? So they all have their interests vis-a-vis the two superpowers in some way, shape or form. But generally speaking, I think all Southeast Asian countries do have a clear sense of their interests in relation to good relations with the US and with China. So they don't want to be in a situation where they have to choose one side or the other. This is a function of the historical evolution of their relationships with the US and China. It's a function of the kind of security concerns they have on the one hand, but on the other hand, economic opportunities that derive from close ties with the US and China as well, right? After all, we are talking about the number one and number two largest economies in the world.
Yeah.
So it's a combination of all these factors that land most Southeast Asian states, if not all, to some degree or other, in that middle position where they would rather not be seen clearly aligned with one or the other. Yeah. And I think the subtext to that also is the concern that if you are seen to be aligned with one, it shuts off opportunities in terms of your relationship with the other. Or worse, you end up at the receiving end of punitive kind of measures that the other party might take against you, particularly in the context of rivalry and competition between the two superpowers, right?
Yes.
And so this speaks to that other side of the coin. We don't want to choose, but the other side is don't make us choose, right? And the perennial concern among Southeast Asian countries that superpowers will in fact make them choose.
Hi, Joe. Congrats
Hi.
to you and Yunfeng on both the article and this really fascinating project.
Thank you.
What I wanted to ask you was, both you and Yunfeng sort of break down competition into 5 different domains, right? Political, diplomatic engagement, military security engagement, economic ties, cultural political affinity, and what we call signaling or public messaging. Right, I think that's great because US-China competition is complex and multidimensional. So I was wondering if you could take our listeners through those 5 different domains, what you looked at for each of those measures, and if you guys saw differences in the different domains in terms of different Southeast Asian countries balancing or hedging on different aspects with regard to both the US and China.
Okay, sure, Adrian. Happy to do that. I'll do it very quickly in the interest of time. Maybe before I do that, first is just to let listeners know why we approach the question in this manner, looking into these different domains and the indicators therein. We were a little bit dissatisfied, I suppose, with the ongoing discussions that we hear in the public space, right, about Southeast Asian countries not wanting to choose and people talking about this and that Southeast Asian country hedging and things like that. And while there was a good sense of how Southeast Asian countries were locating themselves and thinking about relations with China and the United States and really relations in the context of the competition and rivalry, right? We wanted to look at the data and have a sense of what the data was actually telling us. So we wanted to also get a sense of the direction of movement of Southeast Asian states over a period of time. So that's when we decided that, okay, everyone seems to have a sense and will very confidently claim that, Brunei is hedging, Laos is veering towards this direction or that direction, that sort of stuff. So we said, okay, let's look beyond that and let's really see what kind of picture the data is painting. So we decided on a timeline of 30 years and the choice of 30 years stemmed from the fact that, number one, we wanted to have a long enough trajectory so that we can really get a sense of movement, right? The direction of movement. And that was something that we were very interested in. But secondly, we also needed to see whether we had the data, whether we could get the data and how far back, how far ahead we can get data for, right? And anyway, long and short of it is we landed on a 30-year time frame. So roughly it's about the early 90s to the early 2020s. Yeah. The 5 domains that we decided on, some of it is obvious, intuitive, I suppose. Political, diplomatic being one, economics and trade being the other, and security, defense being a third, soft power being the fourth, and the fifth is signals, right? By signals, we were really thinking about the kind of messaging that Southeast Asian countries were getting from leaders in China or in the United States in the form of statements that they were making about the region. And of course, the kind of messaging that we were sending back, or Southeast Asian countries were sending back to the US and China as well. For defense and security, it's fairly straightforward. It's about everything from defense procurement to bilateral exercises with the US or China, and defense exchange, defense agreements. In the case of Philippines, for example, the defense pact with the US. So that's another domain. In terms of economics and trade, also quite straightforward. We were particularly interested in trade statistics. We were also very interested in investments, but here we have to admit that getting data on investments was not very easy.
Yeah.
So we struggled, and we're still working on it actually. So in a sense, it's iterative and it's a project that is still ongoing. But as far as data on investments is concerned, we couldn't get the full 30 years. So the team is still working on that. But nevertheless, investments was an important aspect of economics and trade as well. And then for political diplomatic, it ranges from voting patterns in the United Nations to bilateral meetings and participation and statements in multilateral conferences and things like that. And then the last one, soft power, right? So here you're talking about students, you're talking about cultural exchange. Nothing particularly earth-shattering, but what was fun about the project is bringing all this together, mining the data, and then plotting out the trajectory over a 30-year period. So in a sense, we managed to get a better idea of how Southeast Asian countries were looking at their relations with the superpowers across these domains over 30 years. And the picture that we landed up with is that we do see a very definitive shift basically across almost all Southeast Asian countries, from the US to China, right? Because if you plot it on a spectrum, say the US on one end and China on the other end, and you just narrowly focus on that particular spectrum and you locate Southeast Asian countries along it, depending on how they score on the different indicators, then the consolidated picture that we have over time is that while most of the countries are still very much clustered in the middle, so the whole idea of hedging comes up, right? They're clustered in the middle, but within the middle range, it's sort of like center right, if you take right as the extreme right as the China side of the spectrum, right? So it's increasingly center right in most cases.
I see. Thank you.
Joe, I was wondering if, when you look at the individual indicators, do you see some greater shifts in the individual sort of indicators, say, right, soft power or economics, for example?
Yeah, I think the most profound shifts you really find in the economic realm. And that actually gave rise to one of our main hypotheses, basically that the perception of economic opportunity featured very prominently in how Southeast Asian countries, or at least in terms of explaining the pattern of behavior of Southeast Asian countries. And with regards to economics, it is really the question of the trading opportunities that regional countries have developed with China over this 30-year period, where it went from a very low base to today, China being the largest trading partner for most, if not all, Southeast Asian countries. And although in the case of investments, like I mentioned earlier, it was difficult for us to get a full picture because of limitations of access to data, the sense that we got based on what we have is that even in terms of investment flows, it's interesting, right? Because we all know, it's a well-known fact that the United States is the top investor in Southeast Asia. And it has been so for, practically for the entire 30-year period we covered. But the interesting movement is not on the US side, right? But it's on the China side, because China would have started in the early 90s from virtually zero, right, in terms of investments. And you can imagine over a 30-year period projected to today, a very significant upsurge, a much sharper upsurge, especially over the last 10 to 15 years of Chinese investments into Southeast Asia. So I think the economic side of the ledger is where we had seen the most significant movements.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Conversations that we've had with US officials, they usually like to point out that, America is the region's largest source of foreign direct investment, but for some reason, China is seen as more economically influential. They described it as a messaging problem that people aren't told enough about US investments here to understand what they do. But do you think it's a messaging problem, or do you think it's a broader question of, say, credibility? That, like you mentioned, the US is not present in the contemporary trading landscape of Southeast Asia?
Well, I think that's a very good question, Kevin. And, I certainly agree that the Americans see it this way. And to some extent, I think there's some truth in that. At least in part is a messaging problem, right? and they certainly could do much better in terms of the PR messaging. But they are also constrained basically by the nature and the structure of the investments, right? The problem here being that whereas in the case of the United States, the bulk of the investments are private sector investments. Yeah. And so they are, in that sense, it's difficult to sort of showcase the strategic imperative behind it. It's about commercial intent and seizing economic revenue generation opportunities, right?
Yeah.
In the case of China, I think it's a little bit different, right? You see investments, a large amount of investments and loans in the form of provincial governments and the kind of links that they have and the kind of interest that they have in terms of fostering economic development, especially on the back of the something like the BRI, right? And you also can see quite clearly that as far as China is concerned, it's an economic model that is very top-down. Yes, it has a very vibrant private sector ecosystem, increasingly so, especially in the tech domains, we all know that. But by and large, it's still a very top-down kind of economic model. So it makes it easier for the leadership of the country to harness and to craft a narrative of, regional engagement around the kind of investments and loans that they are making. And point us again to the BRI being the foremost example of that. Quite apart from the issue of whether the BRI is really as successful as it claims to be, and what some of the problems are with it, debt accumulating and bad loans and all that sort of stuff, right? But you set that aside, it's so much easier for them to craft a narrative. And if you look at the grand BRI statements over the last decade, it's quite clear that the Chinese have seized upon that. Yeah. And the BRI is also about infrastructure development.
Yeah.
And if you set aside Singapore, right, if you look at the rest of Southeast Asia, there is a dire need for better infrastructure.
Yeah, exactly. The infrastructure gap across the rest of the region is worth billions of dollars at this point.
Exactly, yeah. And the Chinese are coming in and saying that, we are here to provide that for you. And they have been welcomed and embraced, of course, by the leadership, right? I mean, we know of many examples where the rubber hits the road, when you get down to the actual projects, there's so many problems in relation to local communities, in relation to local governments, in relation to environmental concerns and that sort of stuff, right?
Yeah.
But in terms of the big strategic picture, it's it's a very nice narrative that the Chinese have crafted, that we are here to help you with the biggest economic challenge that you have.
Yeah, definitely true. And this talk about narrative that you keep bringing up, I think it's very important because China has a very clear narrative, like you said. But what exactly is the US narrative, the US value proposition to Southeast Asia at this point? I mean, if I had to guess among the 5 domains that you listed, I imagine that military security probably is one of the stronger domains that the US has right now. But beyond that, what really is the US narrative for this region?
Well, that's a very good question, especially with regards to the current administration, right? I think the current administration doesn't appear to have a lot of bandwidth or real interest as far as Southeast Asia is concerned. In fact, I think increasingly what the administration, the way they look at Southeast Asia today is not as one region, but they are looking at it in terms of handful, probably less than a handful, key partners that they want to work with. And, the rest are, either written off or not a priority or whatever it is. Yeah, but the Vietnams, the Philippines, the Singapores, the Indonesias of the world, these are the ones that we want to focus our attention on. So number one, my impression is that they've disaggregated the region in that sense. Number two, I think you're absolutely right as well that their value proposition continues to be primarily the security domain in terms of the kind of defense relationships, in terms of the defense equipment that they have given Southeast Asian countries access to. And there is certainly a desire in the region for the US to continue playing this offshore balancer role, right? But I think the challenge for Southeast Asia is that, number one, the region would certainly love to have this role being played alongside a very clear economic role as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that part is missing at this point. And number two, as much as they want the United States to play a major security role in the region, they don't want it to be too blatant and too sort of in your face, right? And here lies another challenge, because without that more holistic package, with economic engagement and diplomatic engagement and all that, the security angle just looks sharper, more dominant, and that skewed picture is one that also causes some concerns for regional countries. Yeah. So if you ask me whether the Americans understand that, I think they do. Or certainly the Asia hands in the administration do. But whether the administration itself sees any urgency to resolve this tension, unfortunately, I don't think at this point.
Of course, there's some domestic issues that prevent them from, say, rejoining the CPTPP or, just generally joining the trade landscape in this region again.
Yeah, I mean, economics now, everything is about tariffs. That's not just the main word and signifier. That appears to be the only reference point for America's economic role in the region today.
Yeah, and as far as narratives go, that's not the most positive thing to dwell on.
Not at all, yeah.
Vietnam is the only country in the region to have reached a trade deal with the US, but we're a couple of days from finding out what happens to the rest of the countries in this region.
Yeah, no, I think we're all sort of anxiously waiting and wringing our hands. I mean, even the Vietnamese, I'm not particularly sure that they got a good deal at all, but a deal's a deal, and you just have to live with it.
Yeah, my follow-up was actually on the purported Vietnam deal, right? Because apparently, according to all the reports, there is going to be a 40% tariff on so-called transshipment. So it's that's just a new term for what they used to call China washing, Southeast Asia washing. Do you think that is also going to possibly change the trajectory moving forward as so the Southeast Asian countries now have to further navigate a much more complicated economic trade?
Yeah, I think in theory it certainly suggests so. The emphasis of the administration today is very much on transshipment and very much on making sure that any trade deal that is signed by the Trump administration basically in some way or other sidelines China and China's interests. So that much is clear. Of course, the devil is always in the detail, right? Yes, you want to clamp down on transshipment. It's going to require a lot of effort, a lot of human effort. I always thought it was interesting that on the one hand, they want to pay more attention to this while at the same time reducing the size of their bureaucracy. So they have fewer bureaucrats to do an even more extensive monitoring. Yeah, so I think it's you got to take your hats off to the American officials who are still gamely trying to make all this happen. It's a tall order. It really is a tall order. But of course, they've made it very clear that this is something that they're going to pay attention to. And if you grant them that they are able to basically break down manufactured products and identify all the China and China-related components in them, that would, of course, create a lot of problems for Southeast Asia, because China's value for Southeast Asia, apart from just being a market in itself, for Southeast Asian products, is that they are integral to all the supply chains Southeast Asian companies are involved in. I mean, don't even talk about shutting them out from the supply chains, but just reducing their contribution to the supply chain. It's not going to be easy, right? I mean, you got to find alternative suppliers, alternative supply chains, and you don't know the sustainability of these alternate sources of the material that you need, and it creates a whole new set of problems for local firms and local companies. So it is going to be very difficult. And with regards to the agreement with Vietnam, essentially, I mean, the way I read it, the Trump administration holds, pardon the pun, but they hold the trump cards, right? As far as defining and identifying transshipment is concerned. It's transshipment if I say that it's transshipment, and then bam, I'm going to slap you with 40% tariffs on that. Honestly, I don't know. I don't know how much latitude the Vietnamese have to plead their case if they are being accused of transshipment. Or is it in typical Trump fashion, it is what it is because I say it is, and everyone just has to deal with it. All these have yet to be sorted out. I don't think they can ever be sorted out, in fact.
Yeah, we're going to have to wait to see more details about the deal if they ever come out.
Yeah. And then, of course, the rest of us, those of us who don't yet have deals, but are, hoping for deals or whatever you want to call it, I'm not sure it inspires as much confidence as I think most regional countries were hoping that it would.
So, as I think Joyce has pointed out, this uncertainty, do we expect to see perhaps, right, sort of one move going forward is, right, sort of, we had a China plus one strategy, right? Are we going to see a US plus one strategy moving
No, I
forward,
think you're right. That's the reality now. I mean, increasingly, it makes more and more sense, right? Just purely as a defensive play for firms, for companies concerned about their supply chain, that you now have to seriously think about a US plus one. And over and above that, there's also the question of the unpredictability of US decision making today.
Mm-hmm.
Just take tariffs, right? On again, off again. And then now there's as you guys know, there are a couple of legal cases in the US against the Trump administration and their imposition of tariffs. So we don't even know how that is going to play out, whether the tariffs are going to be deemed illegal. And even if they were, how is that going to be sorted out in the US judicial system? And what does that dynamic within the US judicial system have to do with the rest of us, the rest of the world, who are at the receiving end of these tariffs, right? So there's all these uncertainties that firms and that governments have to factor in when they're dealing with the United States today. So even if you want to have a US plus one strategy, what that strategy looks like, how you are going to identify and deal with the plus one side of it, all this is still up in the air because it's very much dependent on some sense of clarity on how this US administration is going to approach the issue of international trade in a longer term sense, right? At least for the duration of the administration itself, and not just, we're going to have the declaration of the tariff rates in a few days' time, in a couple of days' time. And then there's also the likelihood that that might be changed again because of some new negotiation process, or if the stock markets don't respond in a positive way. So it's just a very, just a very blur picture.
Yes, definitely. And speaking of all this, challenge with regard to engaging the US, the idea of a US plus one strategy, I think another interesting thing in your study was how it pointed out that some countries, such as Indonesia, might be sleepwalking into a closer alignment with China due to an accumulation of its choices. Do you think there are more countries that are falling into this pattern of sleepwalking, or do you think they're going to be more conscious decisions to, move towards China as the US becomes, or ostensibly becomes, more unreliable?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. And to give credit where it's due, this notion of sleepwalking into a particular relationship with China came from the work that a member of our research team, Evan Laksmana at IISS, eminent and leading scholar of Indonesian foreign policy. It was an argument that he made, and he made it in relation to domestic politics, which of course features not just in Indonesia, but across Southeast Asia as well, right? And the idea is basically that certain countries may not be approaching relations with China or the US for the matter in terms of grand strategy, right? Their grand strategy, or they're just their own strategic thinking about how their country should deal with the changing global order. Rather, in many cases, what you have is governments dealing with China, dealing with the US from the perspective of domestic politics. Yeah, whether it's being staunchly anti-US in rhetoric because of what the United States is endorsing in Gaza, or in the case of China, the kind of economic opportunities that present themselves to politicians, to political parties in any given Southeast Asian country. Yeah. And decisions are made on that basis, without thinking of the larger strategic picture. But as a result of these decisions and a number of these decisions, you take those decisions together, then you start to see a drift. So the drift is the outcome of these piecemeal domestic decisions rather than a result of strategic thinking on the part of country A that, it is in our interest to be more closely aligned with superpower X or superpower Y. Yeah. So therein lies the notion of sleepwalking into an alignment, so to speak.
So, from what you found in your study, do these countries realize that they're sleepwalking in such a manner, or is it still something that's flying, mostly under the radar?
Yeah. So to be honest, I can't speak for them, and we certainly didn't intend to. Our intent was a bit more modest. So we just wanted to extract the data to see what kind of picture we get in terms of decisions being made in relation to the United States or China. Yeah.
I see.
And now that we have that picture, it is to present it for the consumption of the public, including decision makers. So the idea is that, you say that you don't want to choose sides, right? But from what we can tell, from the data that we have accumulated, it seems that the decisions that you have been making over this range of issues, over this period of time, actually paints a picture that you have been more and more closely aligned, or at least moving towards alignment with one country or another. So to be clear, our conclusion wasn't that Southeast Asia is with China or Southeast Asia has abandoned the United States. Yeah. Our conclusion is basically that over 30 years and over these indicators, there is a very clear sign that Southeast Asian countries are gravitating towards China.
I see.
And then we present 4 arguments as to why that is so. Domestic politics, perception of economic opportunities, perception of the reliability of American commitment in the region, and fourthly is geography, right? China being not in the region, but very geographically close to the region, whereas the United States is an ocean and a half away. So these are the 4 explanatory variables that we identified. There are probably more, but we identified these 4 that play out in the cases of Southeast Asian countries. And with that picture, we put it to especially the Americans that, look, this is what's happening in the region. The United States has to ask itself how important Southeast Asia really is for them.
Yeah.
Is it a region that they can afford to lose to the influence of a competitor? Yeah. And if they conclude that it is not, if they conclude that it is worth trying to win back Southeast Asia, so to speak, then in terms of these 5 domains, in terms of these 20 indicators, where is the United States lacking and how they might be able to address the deficiencies there? I mean, that's the hope that we have with regards to this project and this paper.
I imagine it's a really challenging question about what the US could conceivably do under the current Trump administration to reverse this regional drift towards China. Because, I mean, of the 4 arguments you raise, you can't change geography.
Yep.
Probably thinking the most potential to change regional perceptions would be if the US somehow did a 180 on its trade position, but that's not happening either.
Yep. Yeah, no, exactly. I think the situation is this, as far as I'm concerned. I know that there are individuals in the administration that will be very troubled by this, will feel that Southeast Asia is very important for the United States, and are in a sense quite, shall we say, mainstream or orthodox, yeah, in terms of how they think about the United States and its conduct of diplomacy and the use of its levers of power and the leverage that it has. But we all know that today in the Trump administration, decisions are basically made by one person. So as much as there are Asia hands in different parts of the administration that are quite sympathetic to all the challenges that we face in the region and see a need for the US to demonstrate in an unequivocal way its interest and commitment to the region, the big question is whether they have any influence on a president who already thinks that he has a very good grasp of what's happening in the world and how he wants to approach everyone else.
In that case, Professor, do you have any last words that you'd like to leave the audience with? Maybe when is this study coming out?
In fact, it should be out in a couple of weeks. So we have the paper in Foreign Affairs. It's kind of like a teaser, right? The interactive model that we are going to make available publicly will be on the website of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. We were aiming for early July, but the web designers are tidying up some stuff. So more likely it will be mid-July. So I would urge your listeners in the second half of July, go to the website of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and it should be up there. And it's interactive, so you can play around with it, right? Depending on what indicators you prefer to place emphasis on, depending on what time frames you want to look at, all that the user can adjust and then get the picture of alignments that comes up on the basis of the data that we have.
Okay, great. This is pretty timely then. This should come out in the next few days. Definitely before
That's the hope. That's the hope.
Okay, great. Thank you for your time, Professor.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Adrian.
And thank you everyone for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If there are any questions or topics that you'd like us to tackle in future episodes, feel free to reach out to us on social media or through email. Until next time, stay safe and we'll see you again.